Hi everybody, you're listening to Comics and History, episode number 124, part 2, Spotlight on the Spectre during the Ostrander-Mandrake run. And welcome to the show. I am your host, Brian J. Rygate, and class is back from recess as we continue our look at the epic third volume of The Spectre by John Ostrander and Tom Mandrake. I ended off the first part by talking about the sharing of the minds between Jim Corrigan / the Spectre and Amy Baderman. And in the first half of the sharing of these two minds, what we got was essentially the post-crisis origin for the Spectre, in which there were a couple of retcons on Ostrander-Mandrake's part, but also a couple of pretty important revelations as well. And now that Corrigan has finished sharing his innermost thoughts and memories with Amy, it's now her turn to share her past with Corrigan. And it turns out she has a pretty tragic backstory. Amy recalls that when she was younger, she married a dashing young fellow named Ted, who loved to dance with her and she with him. But sadly, it turns out that Ted liked going out dancing with other women. In other words, Ted would often leave Amy in the evening or the middle of the night to go on one-night stands with a variety of women. And we don't get the sense that Ted was physically abusive towards Amy, but he was certainly emotionally abusive in that he would just leave her and carry on these affairs with seemingly random women. And so it left Amy in a pretty lonely and desolate place, and she found herself doing much the same as what Ted was doing. She would, instead of staying at home, go out dancing or having one-night love affairs with a number of male partners. And after a time, Ted got ill and then died, and Amy learned that Ted had died from complications brought on by the AIDS virus. And so she went in for testing, and she learned that she had contracted the AIDS virus through her late husband. And on top of that, Amy realized that she had unwittingly passed on the virus to any number of her male partners during the time that she was going out looking for love that she couldn't find from her husband. And so Amy tells Corrigan that she feels quite guilty over what happened. She certainly didn't mean to do any of this, but the reader certainly has a good level of cause for concern over this, because early on in this series, Ostrander and Mandrake have shown the reader that Corrigan is a pretty vengeful guy. The Spectre at this point is full of rage, and Corrigan's hold over the Spectre, we get the sense, is tenuous at best. But to her credit, Amy stands up to Corrigan and says, well, hold on. I may feel guilty, but I'm not evil. I don't deserve to have judgment passed on me. I have to live with this disease, and I have to live with the guilt of what I did completely unintentionally. And it gives Corrigan a pause to reflect on how many times over the past 5 decades he has confused guilt with evil. So, another important step in Corrigan's journey of self discovery. The guilty are not always evil, they do not always deserve to feel the wrath of the Spectre. So early on, Amy becomes an important friend and confidant of Jim's now that they've had this intimate sharing of their histories and their innermost thoughts. But things start to get complicated because Madame Xanadu appears on the scene. And the lead up to the confrontation between Xanadu and Corrigan and Amy is quite interesting. We see her back at her brownstone heading out to find Corrigan and Amy, and we see her with the rest of Corrigan's old Cryptica Crimes gang, including Kim Liang. But all of them, Kim, Signer, Bug, Al, Gina, they all have this spectral appearance about them. They don't appear to be living. And what also gives the reader a pause is that Betty is amongst them. And in the final issue of the Doug Munch run, Betty ended up dying. So there's this question, what exactly is going on with the gang? Did they all die, or were they really alive in the first place? Well, we soon find out as Xanadu tracks down Corrigan and Amy. And she immediately sicks the Cryptic Crimes gang upon Jim. She turns them all into these spectral human wolf hybrids, and they'll manage to pin Corrigan down in place. While Xanadu tries appealing to Amy's feminine, matriarchal sense, you could say, Madame Xanadu explains that she is centuries old, and she remembers a time when the earth was structured along more matriarchal lines. And her regret is that as society has become increasingly patriarchal, it has led to the destruction of the environment, various ecosystems, and it's something which she wants to change. And so she's trying to pull Amy over to her side. Of course, Madame Xanadu is also displeased that Amy wasn't so forthcoming in calling Madame Xanadu and telling her, hey, I found Corrigan. But she doesn't let on so much that she's as angry as you might think she is towards Amy. But now getting back to Corrigan. So Xanadu proceeds to confront Jim, who's still being pinned down. And she drops a pretty major revelation that has pretty major ramifications for how we are to perceive the entirety of the Doug Munch run. Madame Xanadu explains that Jim Corrigan started questioning his mission as the Spectre much earlier than he believes. And Xanadu recalls a time when the Spectre appeared at the window of her brownstone. His cape was looking quite tattered. He was looking humbled. It was as if someone or something had chastised him. And clearly, this is going back to the earliest scenes from Munch's first issue of the Spectre, in which the voice was chastising the Spectre for his failures before and during the Crisis on Infinite Earths. And Xanadu explains that at this point, the Spectre was questioning his mission. He was certainly looking very weak, unsure of where to go. And so Madame Xanadu explains that she offered to help the Spectre, but for a price, a small amount of his power, to which the Spectre agreed. And now Xanadu explains that Corrigan and the Spectre have no recollection of this, but what Xanadu did was she took a small piece of the Spectre's ectoplasm and shaped it into an entirely lifelike replica of Jim Corrigan's body. And she even gave the body autonomous thought. So it appeared that Jim Corrigan had actually been resurrected and that the Spectre was now an entirely separate entity that was still bound to Corrigan in such a way that the Spectre had to return to Corrigan's body after a period of 24 hours, after which the Spectre and Corrigan would both start to weaken, and if 48 hours went by, both Corrigan and the Spectre would die. And Xanadu explains that in order to keep up this ruse, she took a little piece of her own soul and she created Kim Liang as someone who would seduce this Jim Corrigan construct, if you will. And at the same time, Xanadu embarked on a romantic relationship with the Spectre. But having Kim Liang there was a way of making sure Xanadu was taking all of the Spectre under her enthrall the whole time. But then after a time, in order to keep the ruse going, Madame Xanadu created the rest of the Cryptica Crimes gang in order to allow Jim Corrigan to think that even though he'd gone through that severe change midway through the Munch run, Corrigan still had a measure of independence from the Spectre, and so now he had this group of assistants to work with. So this completely changes our perspective on the Doug Munch run, and that we see that the changes that Munch enacted at the start and the midway point of the run were all a really duplicitous ploy by Madame Xanadu to try to take the power of the Spectre for herself. So for those fans who did not enjoy the more bwahaha elements of the Munch run, one could now say, well, this wasn't really happening literally. This was all what Jim Corrigan or the Spectre were perceiving. And certainly you can read the Doug Munch run on its own, read it at surface level, and still enjoy it for what it was. But now there's this whole new layer of meaning. And it's a really neat way for Ostrander-Mandrake to take what came before and still fit it into the greater continuity of the Spectre. It certainly helps to explain why during the Munch run Jim Corrigan wasn't that hard-boiled character, why he preferred to wear 80s fashions and have his hair styled a little bit differently. This wasn't really Jim Corrigan that we were seeing. It was a piece of the Spectre's ectoplasm. And so it was the Spectre who was the true mind or the true entity, you could say. So really neat job done by Ostrander-Mandrake, all within one issue, I must add. So after revealing the truth to Corrigan and to Amy, Madame Xanadu proceeds to separate the Spectre from Jim Corrigan. And Corrigan isn't allowed to go up to the heavens immediately. He still finds himself bound to Earth, and he's able to continue communicating with Amy. Meanwhile, Madame Xanadu has bound the Spectre to herself, and her plan is to use the power of the Spectre to heal the Earth. But instead, she goes about confronting men who she sees as people who are responsible for the destruction of the environment, and she enacts pretty cruel vengeance upon them. So it's up to Corrigan and Amy together to confront Xanadu and make her realize that The power of the Spectre cannot be